All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're looking at something most of us can't imagine going a day without coffee. But we're not going to debate the best brewing methods or anything like that. We're going way deeper into the biochemistry to explore how coffee, especially caffeine, could actually impact type 2 diabetes.
It really is a fascinating area of research. It touches on so many different systems in the body. We've got 3 papers here to get us started.
Oh, a whole stack of research.
Yeah. So one is a pretty comprehensive review looking at coffee's overall effects on type 2 diabetes risk and all the potential complications.
So it's a big picture stuff.
Exactly. Then we've got another one that zooms in on caffeine's molecular targets, what it's actually doing at a cellular level. A lot of focus on the central nervous system in that one.
Makes sense. Caffeine is famous for its brain-boosting effects.
And then this last one is interesting. It's focused on caffeine and its effects on the brain more broadly, but there's a whole section on epilepsy in there, which is, not something you'd immediately connect with coffee.
Okay, so some unexpected twists and turns in this deep dive. I like it. Now, before we get too far into the weeds, I think it's worth taking a step back. For our listeners out there who are, say, second-year biology or biotech students like yourself, let's make sure we're all on the same page. When we say type 2 diabetes, what's the core issue going on at a cellular level? Like, what's actually broken?
Yeah, good point. It's all about glucose homeostasis, or rather, the lack of it.
So, the body's ability to regulate blood sugar.
Right. In a healthy person, you've got insulin, a hormone that's produced by the pancreas. And insulin's basically the signal that tells your cells, hey, there's glucose in the bloodstream, grab it and use it for energy.
It's like a key that unlocks the door for glucose to enter cells.
Exactly. But in type 2 diabetes, that whole system gets messed up. Either the pancreas isn't pumping out enough insulin, or the cells themselves become resistant to insulin signal. They basically stop listening.
So the key is there, but the lock is jammed. And that's when the problems start, right? If that glucose can't get into the cells where it's needed, it just builds up in the blood.
Yeah, that's when you get what's called chronic hypoglycemia, basically, chronically high blood sugar. And that's where those serious complications come in. Over time, that excess glucose damages your blood vessels and nerves.
Setting the stage for a whole cascade of health issues.
Right. Retinopathy, which can lead to blindness, cardiovascular disease, neuropathy. It affects basically every system in the body.
So it's not just about, watching your sugar intake. It's a much bigger deal than that. Okay, so we've got this complex disease, serious consequences. Where does coffee fit into all of this? I mean, it's not just about getting that caffeine kick to start your day, right?
Oh, definitely not. Coffee is way more interesting than people give it credit for. It's actually a really complex mixture of bioactive compounds.
Okay, so beyond the caffeine.
Way beyond. I mean, we all know about the 2 main types of coffee beans, Arabica and Robusta. But even within those, there are tons of other chemicals that play a role in flavor, aroma, and potentially our health.
We're talking things like chlorogenic acids, caffeistol, caweol. It's a mouthful.
It is, isn't it? And that's not even the half of it. And then you've got to factor in the roasting process that completely transforms the beans, creates those characteristic coffee flavors and aromas we love.
That makes sense. But you're saying it changes the chemistry too, right?
Absolutely. Roasting alters the concentration and activity of those bioactive compounds. Some get broken down, others become more potent.
So every cup of coffee is kind of unique based on its chemical journey, from bean to cup.
Yeah, you could say that. The origin of the beans, how they're roasted, how you brew them, it all contributes to the final composition. It's almost like a chemical fingerprint.
That's pretty amazing. All right, let's zoom in on the molecule that everyone knows, caffeine. What's the basic mechanism behind that energy boost? What's happening in our brains when we drink coffee?
So caffeine is sneaky. It works by basically mimicking another molecule, adenosine.
Adenosine, as in?
Yeah, it's a neurotransmitter, one of the brain's chemical messengers, and it binds to specific receptors in the brain. When adenosine binds, it promotes sleep and relaxation, makes you feel calm and drowsy, but caffeine comes along and...
Reacts as the party.
Pretty much. It binds to those same adenosine receptors, but doesn't trigger the same sleepy effect. It's like an imposter, blocking the real deal from getting through.
So instead of winding down, our brains stay alert and active.
Exactly. And that adenosine blockade has a domino effect on other neurotransmitters. It boosts the activity of dopamine and norepinephrine, which are associated with alertness, focus, and motivation.
That explains that feeling of mental clarity and energy after that first cup. But there's always a flip side, right? What are some of the downsides of this caffeine-induced party in our brains?
Well, like any party that goes on too long, things can get a little messy. Too much caffeine can lead to anxiety, you might feel jittery, have trouble sleeping, and of course there's the dreaded caffeine withdrawal.
Those headaches are no joke.
Yeah.
So, moderation is key, as with most things in life. But caffeine aside, are there other players in this coffee diabetes drama that we need to consider?
Absolutely. Remember that whole cast of characters we talked about earlier? Well, chlorogenic acids, or CGAs for short, are pretty impressive. They're powerful antioxidants, and there's some really interesting research linking them to blood sugar control.
Antioxidants. Those are the molecules that fight off free radicals, right? The ones that damage our cells.
That's right. Free radicals are unstable molecules, and they can wreak havoc in our bodies. They contribute to all sorts of chronic diseases. Antioxidants, like CGAs, neutralize those troublemakers. They help protect our cells from damage.
So coffee's like a superhero, fighting off those cellular villains.
In a way, yeah. And this antioxidant action is especially important when we're talking about diabetes, because oxidative stress, that's what we call the damage caused by free radicals, plays a huge role in the development of all those diabetic complications.
So coffee could potentially be doing double duty, helping to manage blood sugar and protecting against the damage that diabetes can cause. That's pretty impressive. But how does this actually play out at a cellular level? Can we get specific?
Sure, let's get into it. One of the key areas of interest is how coffee, and specifically caffeine, affects how our bodies absorb glucose. Research has actually shown that caffeine can inhibit glucose absorption in the small intestine.
So it's like hitting the brakes on the influx of sugar into the bloodstream after you eat.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this effect on glucose absorption could be really important for managing blood sugar, especially for people with type 2 diabetes.
Okay, so it's not just about slowing down that initial sugar rush. You're saying it's also about improving how our bodies respond to insulin in the long run.
Exactly. Improving insulin sensitivity means our cells actually listen to insulin signals and let glucose in more readily. And that's a major goal when it comes to managing type 2 diabetes.
Is making those cellular locks work properly again?
Yeah, precisely.
So it seems like coffee's shaping up to be a pretty valuable tool in this fight against diabetes. But earlier, you mentioned some conflicting research findings. What's the catch?
Well, it's not always a simple story. Some studies, particularly the ones that just look at the short-term effects, have shown that caffeine can actually cause a spike in blood glucose levels right after you drink it.
Really? So coffee could actually make blood sugar worse in the short term?
It seems that way, at least in some cases. But the long-term studies paint a different picture. They tend to find a link between regular coffee consumption and better glucose control over time.
So maybe it's about the long game. The long-term benefits might outweigh those initial ups and downs.
That's one possibility. But it's important to remember that the research is still ongoing, and there's a lot we still don't understand about how coffee, caffeine, and our individual metabolisms all interact.
It's a good reminder that our bodies are complex systems. What works for one person might not work the same way for another. But let's switch gears a bit. We've talked a lot about caffeine. What about those other bioactive compounds? What role do they play in this whole story?
Yeah, let's get back to those antioxidants we were talking about. Remember the chlorogenic acids, or CGAs?
The free radical fighters.
The very same. They're hard at work combating oxidative stress, which, as we talked about, is a major player in those diabetic complications.
Right. Oxidative stress is like a wrecking ball at a cellular level, causing all sorts of damage that can lead to problems like retinopathy, cardiovascular disease, and even nerve damage.
Exactly. And studies have shown that drinking coffee, especially the kinds that are rich in those CGAs, is actually linked to higher levels of those antioxidant enzymes in the body.
So those are like our internal defense systems against free radical damage.
Exactly. And coffee seems to be boosting our natural defenses.
That's amazing. So how does that translate into real benefits for people with diabetes?
Well, let's take diabetic retinopathy, for example. It's one of those serious complications of diabetes that can actually lead to vision loss. And guess what? Oxidative stress is a huge part of what causes it.
So by fighting oxidative stress, could coffee actually help protect our eyesight?
It's an area of active research, and the results are looking pretty promising. And it's not just retinopathy. Some studies suggest those antioxidant effects could be protecting the cardiovascular system, too.
That's huge, especially considering that heart disease is a leading cause of death for people with diabetes.
Yeah, no question. But we do have to be careful here. The research on coffee and cardiovascular disease is still a bit mixed. Some studies show a positive association, others don't. We need more research to really tease out what's going on.
Okay, so it's not a guaranteed shield against heart disease, but the potential benefits are definitely worth exploring. What about weight management? I mean, obesity is a huge risk factor for type 2 diabetes. Could coffee help with that?
That's a great question. There's some evidence out there that coffee might have what we call anti-obesogenic properties. Basically, it could help prevent or manage obesity.
Okay, so not a weight loss miracle, but maybe a helpful tool.
Right. Caffeine itself has a thermogenic effect.
Maybe.
It means it can slightly increase our metabolic rate, how many calories we burn at rest.
So coffee might give our metabolism a little boost.
Possibly. And some research suggests that certain compounds in coffee, like those chlorogenic acids, might help suppress appetite.
So feel fuller for longer, less likely to overeat. That's good news for anyone trying to manage their weight.
It is. But remember, we're talking about subtle effects here. Coffee is not a magic bullet for weight loss. A balanced diet and regular exercise are still the foundation.
Right, no shortcuts. But coffee could be a nice little bonus in our weight loss toolkit. But let's get back to caffeine's effects on the brain. You mentioned it interacts with various neurotransmitters. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So we've already talked about how caffeine blocks those adenosine receptors, which ends up increasing the activity of certain neurotransmitters. Dopamine and norepinephrine, for example. Those are involved in a lot of functions: mood, motivation, attention, alertness.
That explains why we often feel more focused and energized after a cup of coffee. What about those other effects? You mentioned something about pain modulation. How does caffeine factor into that?
So it's thought that the way caffeine interacts with adenosine receptors could also have an impact on how we perceive pain. Some studies have shown that caffeine can actually make certain painkillers more effective.
Yeah.
Maybe by reducing inflammation and influencing how pain signals travel in the nervous system.
So coffee could potentially boost the power of painkillers. Good to know next time I have a headache.
It's an interesting area of research, that's for sure. But we need more studies to really confirm this and figure out the optimal caffeine dose for managing pain. And speaking of potential benefits, there's even some research suggesting that caffeine might play a role in protecting against neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
Coffee, a brain protector. That's wild. How does that even work?
Well, the thought is that those antioxidant properties, along with caffeine's ability to influence certain pathways in the brain, might help protect against the damage that happens in these diseases. But again, this is another area where we need more research to really understand the complex relationships at play.
Okay, so coffee might be good for our hearts, our eyes, our brains. It really is starting to sound like a superhero. But let's not forget that caffeine can have its downsides, too. We've talked about the anxiety, insomnia, and dependence. What about its effects on people with certain neurological conditions, like epilepsy?
Yeah, that's an important one to address. The relationship between caffeine and epilepsy is complicated, and the research is kind of all over the place. Some studies, especially those that use animal models, suggest that caffeine can actually lower the seizure threshold, basically make seizures more likely to happen.
That sounds concerning. So coffee could actually trigger seizures in people with epilepsy.
It's not quite that straightforward. Animal studies aren't always a perfect predictor of how things will work in humans. And other research, including some studies with human participants, has shown that chronic caffeine consumption, so regular intake over time, might actually decrease the likelihood of seizures and even protect the brain from damage after a seizure.
Wait, so caffeine could be both pro-seizure and anti-seizure. That's confusing.
I know, right? It's possible that its effect depends on a lot of factors. The dose, how often someone drinks coffee, the type of epilepsy they have, individual sensitivity. It's definitely an area where we need more research to get a clearer picture.
It just goes to show that when it comes to health, there's rarely a one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Absolutely. And that's especially true when we're talking about something as complex as the brain.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've gone from the coffee bean to the brain, exploring the fascinating world of coffee, caffeine, and their potential effects on type 2 diabetes. We've looked at multiple research papers, delved into the molecular details, and even tackled some pretty challenging topics like epilepsy and those long-term effects of caffeine. But there's still so much more to uncover.
So one really fascinating area of research is looking at how coffee affects this protein called GLUT4.
GLUT4, remind me.
Okay, so think of GLUT4 as like a gatekeeper. It sits on the surface of muscle cells, and its job is to basically usher glucose from the bloodstream into the muscle where it can be used for energy.
So it's essential for getting glucose where it needs to go. And coffee messes with these gatekeepers.
Well, messes with might not be the right term. Studies suggest that coffee, especially caffeinated coffee, might actually enhance how GLUT4 moves to the cell surface, making it more efficient at taking up glucose.
So it's like giving those gatekeepers a boost, making them work better.
Yeah, exactly. Allowing more glucose to get into the muscle cells where it's needed.
That's really interesting. So coffee could be helping our muscles use glucose more effectively, which is like key for managing type 2 diabetes.
Exactly. And this all ties back to what we were talking about before about insulin sensitivity.
Right. So the more sensitive our cells are to insulin, the better they respond to its signals.
And that means glucose can enter the cells more easily, which is what we want.
It's all about getting those cellular locks working smoothly again. Okay, so coffee seems like it could be a real ally in managing type 2 diabetes. But, earlier you mentioned some conflicting research findings. What's the deal with that? Is there something we're missing?
Yeah, it's not always a clear-cut story, unfortunately. Some studies, especially the ones looking at those immediate short-term effects, have shown that caffeine can actually cause a spike in blood glucose levels when you first drink it.
Wait, really? So coffee could actually make blood sugar worse in the short term?
It appears so, at least in some cases. But here's the thing. The long-term studies, the ones that look at regular coffee consumption over time, often show a different picture. They tend to find an association between drinking coffee regularly and improved glucose control in the long run.
So maybe it's like a delayed reaction, or like those initial fluctuations don't really matter in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, that's a possibility. We need more research to really tease it apart. It's just important to remember that there's still a lot we don't know about the complex interplay between coffee, caffeine, and how our individual metabolisms respond.
Right. No two bodies are exactly alike. Yeah. What works for one person might not work for another. Okay, so we've talked a lot about caffeine, but what about all those other bioactive compounds in coffee? Do they have a part to play in this?
Absolutely. Let's go back to those antioxidants we were talking about. Remember the chlorogenic acids, the CGAs?
The ones fighting off those free radicals?
Yep, those are the ones. And they're hard at work battling oxidative stress, which we know is a major factor in all those diabetic complications.
Right. Oxidative stress is like a cellular wrecking ball, causing damage that can lead to problems like retinopathy, cardiovascular disease, even nerve damage.
Exactly. And studies have shown that coffee consumption, especially the varieties high in CGAs, is associated with higher levels of those antioxidant enzymes in the body.
Our internal defense systems against free radical damage.
Exactly. It's like coffee is giving our natural defenses a boost.
That's incredible. But how does that actually translate into real benefits for people with diabetes?
Well, think about diabetic retinopathy, for example. That's a serious complication that can lead to vision loss. And, oxidative stress is a major culprit in how it develops.
So by fighting oxidative stress, are you saying that coffee's antioxidants could actually help protect our eyesight?
It's definitely an area of active research, and the findings so far are pretty exciting. And it may not stop there. Some studies even suggest that coffee's antioxidant effects might extend to protecting the cardiovascular system as well.
That would be huge, especially considering that heart disease is a leading cause of death for people with diabetes.
No doubt about it. But we do need to acknowledge that the research on coffee and cardiovascular disease is still a little mixed. Some studies show a positive link, others don't. We need more research to really nail down those connections.
Okay, so coffee might not be a foolproof shield against heart disease, but the potential benefits are definitely something to keep an eye on. What about weight management? Obesity is a major risk factor for type 2 diabetes. Could coffee play a role there?
That's a great question. There is some evidence that coffee might have what we call anti-obesogenic properties, meaning it could potentially help prevent or manage obesity.
So not a weight loss miracle drug, but maybe a helpful tool in the toolbox.
Right. So caffeine itself is known to have what we call a thermogenic effect.
Thermogenic? Does that mean?
It means it can slightly increase our metabolic rate. Basically, how many calories we burn at rest.
So coffee could give our metabolism a bit of a nudge.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And then there's research suggesting that certain compounds in coffee, like those chlorogenic acids we keep talking about, might also help suppress appetite.
So feeling fuller for longer, less likely to overeat. That could be really helpful for people trying to manage their weight.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that we're talking about subtle effects here. Coffee isn't a magic bullet for weight loss. It's not going to replace a healthy diet and regular exercise.
Right. It's all about those lifestyle changes. But coffee could be a nice little bonus. Okay, let's circle back to caffeine's effects on the brain. You mentioned it interacts with various neurotransmitters. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So we've already talked about how caffeine blocks those adenosine receptors, and that ends up increasing the activity of other neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine. These are involved in all sorts of things like mood, motivation, attention, alertness.
Which explains why we often feel more focused and energized after that cup of coffee.
Exactly. But what about some of those other effects we were talking about, like pain modulation?
Yeah. How does caffeine fit into that?
Well, it's thought that how caffeine interacts with those adenosine receptors could also affect how we perceive pain. Some studies have shown that caffeine can actually enhance the effectiveness of certain painkillers, perhaps by reducing inflammation and affecting how pain signals are transmitted in the nervous system.
So coffee could actually boost the power of painkillers. That's good to know.
It's an interesting area of research, that's for sure. We do need more studies to confirm those findings and figure out the optimal caffeine intake for pain management. And speaking of potential benefits, there's even research suggesting that caffeine might play a role in protecting against neurodegenerative diseases, things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
Wait, coffee is a brain protector? Seriously?
It's a possibility. The thinking is that those antioxidant properties, along with caffeine's ability to influence certain pathways in the brain, might offer some protection against the damage that occurs in those diseases. But again, this is an area where more research is needed to fully understand the complex relationships.
Okay, so coffee might be good for our hearts, our eyes, our brains. It's like a multi-organ superhero. But we can't forget that caffeine has its downsides, too. We've talked about the anxiety, the insomnia, the potential for dependence. What about its effects on people with certain neurological conditions, like epilepsy, for example?
Yeah, that's an important one to consider. The relationship between caffeine and epilepsy is complex, and the research findings haven't always been consistent. Some studies, especially the ones using animal models, suggest that caffeine can lower the seizure threshold, meaning it might make seizures more likely.
So coffee could potentially trigger seizures in people with epilepsy.
Well, it's not quite that straightforward. Animal studies don't always perfectly reflect what happens in humans. And other research, including some studies in humans, has found that chronic caffeine consumption, so regular intake over time, might actually decrease the likelihood of seizures and even protect the brain from damage after a seizure happens.
Hold on, so caffeine could be both pro-seizure and anti-seizure. That's a little confusing.
I know, it's a bit of a paradox. It's possible that caffeine's effects on seizures depend on a lot of things, like the dose, how often someone consumes caffeine, the type of epilepsy they have, even individual sensitivity. It's definitely an area where we need more research to really clarify what's going on.
It just goes to show that when it comes to health and the brain, there are rarely easy answers. What works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly, and that's why personalized approaches to health are so important.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground about the potential impact of coffee and caffeine, especially when it comes to type 2 diabetes. Let's take a step back for a second. What are the big takeaways here?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that coffee is so much more than just a caffeine hit. It's a complex mixture of bioactive compounds, and each one could have an effect on our health.
Yeah, we tend to just focus on the caffeine, but you're right. The chlorogenic acids, the caffestyl, CoA, they're all part of the bigger picture.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that research is suggesting that both caffeinated and decaffeinated coffee could have benefits when it comes to managing type 2 diabetes. We're talking about things like improving insulin sensitivity, potentially protecting against complications like retinopathy and cardiovascular disease, even possible effects on weight management.
Coffee's kind of like a hidden gem, just waiting to be fully explored.
I like that. But like with anything that could impact our health, we need to look at coffee with a balanced view. It's not a miracle cure.
No magic bullets. It's about incorporating coffee into an overall approach to managing type 2 diabetes and always talking to your doctor or a healthcare professional.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that research is always evolving. What we know today could change as scientists learn more.
That's the beauty of science, right? It's a constant process of learning and discovery.
Exactly. And as we keep learning more about coffee and how it affects our bodies, it's important to turn that knowledge into practical advice.
So let's bring this back to our everyday lives. What does all of this mean for our coffee habits?
Well, I think this deep dive gives us the knowledge to make smarter choices about our coffee consumption. We can think about our own personal health goals, our caffeine tolerance, and any potential risks.
Like, are we drinking coffee for the energy boost, the possible health benefits, or just because we enjoy the taste and the ritual of it?
Right. And it's also about finding what works for you individually. Maybe trying different types of coffee, different roasts, different brewing methods, even playing around with what time of day you drink it.
It's like an invitation to experiment and see what feels best.
Exactly. And just like with any kind of exploration, it's always a good idea to have a guide. Talking to a healthcare professional can be super helpful, especially if you have any existing health conditions. They can help you weigh the potential benefits and risks of coffee and make sure it fits into your overall health plan.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of coffee, caffeine, and type 2 diabetes, here's something to think about as you sip your next cup. Given all of coffee's potential effects, good, maybe not so good, how can you personalize your coffee drinking to make sure you're getting the most benefits, minimizing any risks, and making it really work for you?
It's a great question to consider. And hopefully with every sip, you'll discover something new to appreciate about this amazing beverage.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, happy sipping.